you need that hug. A nice study showed that if you get more than 7 hugs a day, you have 30% less likelihood of ever having flu. And so there's this beautiful interaction between the human immune system, the microbiome, and the energetics of hugs that start to create this matrix of communication. The hug, you're communicating at the electron level. The exchange of genetic information in that hug also happens, where you can swap microbiome on the skin, you can swap it in your breath, and that's extremely important. The more robust you get in the exchange of information at the microbial level, the stronger your immune system function is, the more clear the immune system understands how to operate within the matrix of millions of foreign species that are interacting with your body all the time appropriately. That balance is really achieved through biodiversity, not through isolation. And so the hug is a critical tool for healing. It's a critical tool for communication, critical tool for updating our own consciousness and exchange of respect for one another.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey, Hilda here. 2020 was something else, wasn't it? So how did we ever come up with an episode called The Best of 2020? Well, it's not about the best moments of the year, though we are certain there must have been some of those. We simply took excerpts from 3 of our most listened to podcast episodes of the year and put them together for you. This is episode 288, a sampler podcast episode of sorts. We cover how to shore up your health following traditional food ways with Sally Fallon Morell. We uncover what some of the driving forces are behind this global crisis with Leslie Manookian. And with Dr. Zach Bush, we discuss how to take our health into our own hands, becoming proactive rather than reactive at this time. We'll dive into the excerpts in just a moment. Real quick, I just want to ask, did you see that we had a flash conference in November at Polyface Farms? It happened in the blink of an eye. But guess what? The blink was recorded. What I mean is you can watch the videos of all the talks from Del Bigtree, Joel Salatin, Sally Fallon Morell, and more on the westonaprice.org website in the members portal. Are you not a member yet? Join us for only $30, which is a special price for podcast listeners. Just use the code POD10, that's POD and the number 10, and join at westonaprice.org. And if you're a member already, please give a donation of any size as a year-end gift to keep this work going. The education, research, and activism of the Foundation depends on you. And thank you in advance. Also, a big thank you to Ancestral Supplements for their faithful sponsorship this year. Discover their Ancestral Supplements grass-fed blood vitality. Ancestral Supplements makes New Zealand-sourced, nose-to-tail, organ meats, bone marrow, and blood in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Our ancestors knew that blood made us healthy, smart, and strong. And thankfully, this wisdom hasn't been entirely lost. Throughout many cultures, blood is still honored every day as a sacred food and used in many dishes. Blood Vitality provides us with all of the nutritional building blocks we need to support our own life force, blood. So visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Okay, first up is an excerpt of an interview with Sally Fallon Morell from episode 232. Protect yourself from the coronavirus or any virus. Sally is the president of the Weston A. Price Foundation, a popular author and speaker, and a longtime advocate of ancestral wisdom. Sally shares with us today practical tips for supporting the immune system, from taking 1 tablespoon of coconut oil per day to eating liver once a week.
The right diet creates a healthy immune system. And if you have a healthy immune system, you are impervious to these bugs. Or if you get the disease, whatever it is, you have a mild case. It's probably doing you some good in some way.
So the right diet would include, I imagine, fat-soluble vitamins?
Well, first and foremost is vitamin A. So vitamin A is our number one protection against disease. And this has been known for a long time. It's just absolutely fundamental. And most Americans do not get enough vitamin A, or they think that they get vitamin A from leafy green vegetables and orange and red fruits. And this is not correct. We get carotenes from these foods, but it's very difficult for us to convert these carotenes, and we certainly can't get enough vitamin A, the kind of vitamin A that we need from fruits and vegetables. And yet all the newspapers are saying, eat lots of fruits and vegetables.
For your vitamin A.
For your vitamin A. There's no vitamin A in fruits and vegetables. I mean, that's just axiomatic. Now, we don't typically eat the kind of foods that provide us with vitamin A. And the basic food that provides us with vitamin A is liver. Vitamin A is stored in the liver. So we say eat liver once a week. And it doesn't have to be a piece of liver if you don't like liver. It can be pate, and it could be desiccated liver pills. But you definitely want to have some liver in your diet. And take cod liver oil. That's the other thing that we really think is important. Before the Second World War, before we had antibiotics, cod liver oil was recognized as what gave us protection against infectious disease.
Really?
Yes, and there was a huge public health campaign to get everybody taking cod liver oil. My late husband told me that they got their cod liver oil until about 1953 in England. Through the war until 1953.
Oh.
And that protected everyone from the measles, the flu. It reduced absenteeism. It was given out in schools, and the doctor gave it out. And even if you went to Sunday school, you got your cod liver oil.
How did it fall out of fashion?
Well, antibiotics came along, and they were touted as the new scientific thing, and the emphasis on cod liver oil just kind of waned. I think there was a lot of influence in the background. But it's a shame because the importation of cod liver oil went down to about 10% of what it had been before.
Wow. And so, liver, cod liver oil, what other foods contain vitamin A?
Well, butter and egg yolks, caviar, fatty fish, but the real high values come from liver.
Okay. Now, I know you've mentioned also that vitamin D is important.
Right. Vitamin D and vitamin A are like twins. They work together. And I'm very concerned when I'm reading this in the paper, I read it in the paper this morning, take some vitamin D capsules. And this is not a healthy way to do this because every molecule of vitamin A requires vitamin D, and every molecule of vitamin D requires vitamin A.
They need each other.
They need each other. And so if you're taking a whole bunch of vitamin D, that's going to deplete you of vitamin A, especially if you're not taking any. The beauty of cod liver oil and also poultry liver is that they come together in the same package. So, you don't want to take those capsules, but you do want to have the foods rich in both vitamins.
Wow. I'm sure this seems so foreign to people because cod liver oil, liver, who's eating these things anymore? I mean, I know we do.
We do, yeah.
But the general population, they're probably happy to pop some pills because they don't know.
Well, you can do cod liver oil in pills.
Okay.
And I urge people to go to our website and get the brands that we recommend because most brands of cod liver oil are so highly processed that it actually destroys the natural A and D in the cod liver oil, and synthetic is put back in. So we only recommend cod liver oil that's got the natural vitamins, that hasn't been heated. And that's the one thing where we talk about brand names on our website.
Oh, okay. And also, caveat, fish oil and cod liver oil are not the same thing.
Very good point. Fish oil is an industrial product. It is boiled for hours at 230 degrees. It's not a good source of vitamins A and D. And they say, well, it's a good source of omega-3 fatty acids, but not the way it's processed. Those will be destroyed by the processing.
Okay. So what about vitamin C? I've heard a lot about vitamin C in terms of it boosting our immunity. Should we get more of that in our diet as well?
Yes, and I always like to get it from food. And the best source of vitamin C is fermented foods like sauerkraut.
Yeah.
There's 10 times more vitamin C in sauerkraut than there is in cabbage. So the fermentation process really increases the vitamin C. And, of course, there's fruits and vegetables. Also, if you want to take more vitamin C, I recommend something that's just like a powdered plant that's rich in vitamin C. So it's really the natural vitamin C.
Interesting. I just saw this video recently talking about how the Native Americans in regions where they didn't have a lot of access to fruit and vegetables would have the glands of the caribou and the moose to get their vitamin C. They actually got it from that.
Yeah, well, the adrenal glands really concentrate vitamin C. And when they killed a moose, and Dr. Price describes this, they took out the raw adrenal glands and they cut it into as many pieces as there were tribes members. Oh. And everybody swallowed a little piece of the adrenal glands. And they said that's how we prevent scurvy, the white man's disease.
Amazing.
So they knew how to do it.
Now talk to me about bone broth, because I know that's a healing food to take in. That's also detoxing and boosts immunity, right?
Right. So bone broth is really high in glycine, and glycine is our number one detoxifier in the body, and it supports digestive health. It's just a very, very protective against any kind of disease, especially respiratory disease.
Interesting, because you know how we always say chicken soup for the sick. Maybe this is why, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. So, and it's a very big component of our diet, the Wise Traditions diet. So, yeah, keep on doing it.
But we're not talking the little bouillon cubes.
No, and we're not talking the boxes that are sitting on the store shelves. We're talking about real, as my husband would say, real dinkum bone broth. You can buy frozen bone broth. We have lots of brands listed in our shopping guide, or you can make it. We always recommend that you buy a whole chicken, save the bones, buy the feet or the heads or both, and when you have a bunch of bones saved up, you put those in your slow cooker and you make bone broth, chicken broth.
And it's so delicious too, right?
It's such it perks you up, picks you up.
That's so neat. Yeah. Plus, it makes you look good. I remember when I interviewed Kim Schutte about detoxing, and she said bone broth can actually help eliminate crow's feet. Like, we can be beautiful from the inside out because of the glycine and the collagen and other stuff.
Right. What is bone broth? It's melted collagen. And you need collagen for your skin, your digestive tract, for your joints, your tendons, to hold your body together. There's more collagen in your body than muscle.
Interesting.
More collagen protein than muscle protein. So, you need to feed and support and nourish that collagen. And the way to do it is with broth, bone broth.
Now, what about coconut oil, Sally?
Yes, so coconut oil is a very good fat for viruses. The coronavirus is a lipid-coated virus, and that's what just, I say pegs out with the types of fats that are in coconut oil, the medium-chain triglycerides in coconut oil. So I would have a tablespoon of coconut oil every day, one way or the other. You can cook in it. You can melt it in soups. You can just melt it in a mug with a spoonful of molasses and pretend that that's coffee.
And what do you mean pegs out again?
Mean? Several people ask me about this. It's slang for die. And it comes from cribbage. When you peg out in cribbage, you lose.
Oh. So the coconut oil can kill the coronavirus?
Yes, it absolutely can.
Oh, really?
In the gut, yes.
Now, is that the same thing as MCT oil?
Yes, it is. The MCT oil comes from coconut oil. So, the only difference...
I've always wondered, I guess, if that's as good.
Well, no, I don't think so, because MCT oil is missing the lauric acid, which is one of the very special fatty acids that's in coconut oil. So they take the oil out of the coconut, they remove the lauric acid because they use that in all kinds of cosmetics and things like that. You see sodium lauryl sulfate. Anytime you see laurel, that's the lauric acid. It's a 12-carbon fatty acid, and they get it from coconut oil.
I see.
So because that's so valuable, then what's left is the MCT oil. That's okay too, but the coconut oil is really the best.
It's the real deal. Well, I love it. I cook in a lot. And that takes us just to the subject of fats. So what is the role of fat in protecting our bodies from sickness?
Well, especially the coronavirus, because the coronavirus has an affinity for the lungs. The coronavirus is spread by coughing or sneezing into the air, and if there's viruses in that spray, they get into your lungs. The coronavirus doesn't infect your gut or your skin, it infects the lungs.
Okay.
So the lungs have to be working well, and one of the things the lungs need to work is saturated fat. The lung surfactants are two saturated fat molecules joined to phosphorus. And so, yes, you need lots of saturated fat. And at the same time, you want to avoid the industrial fats and oils.
And saturated fat is the kind that is solid at room temperature, is that right?
That's right. So it'll be butter, lard, coconut oil, meat fats. There's saturated fat in egg yolks, cream, cheese. I mean, all the delicious foods are the foods that protect us against illness and give us healthy lungs.
For the rest of this conversation, look up Wise Traditions Podcast 232 wherever you get your podcasts. Next up is an excerpt from Wise Traditions Podcast number 238, Behind the Coronavirus with Leslie Manookian. Leslie is the writer and director of The Greater Good. Today, Leslie reviews surprising data related to the virus and our current health crisis, including the fact that 99% of the people who get the virus require no medical attention, and how the initial computer model predictions of the severity of the pandemic were way off base. To hear this episode in its entirety, check out Wise Traditions Podcast number 238 wherever you get your podcasts.
What I talked about with respect to Britain and California, that millions more people have been exposed but not actually developed symptoms. It's not that they're asymptomatic. Their immune system just took care of it. They don't have any issue with it. They were more than capable of fighting it off, and so they don't have any problem with it. I've read that 99% of the people who actually get it and get symptoms actually do respond fine without any kind of medical intervention. It's only a very, very tiny minority. And I'm not downplaying those people who do become susceptible, who do have a comorbidity or who are elderly. I'm not downplaying any of the illness or the death from it. I am simply questioning whether or not the reaction to this has been commensurate with the risk. And I don't believe that's the case.
Well, even Fauci's numbers have gone down. In other words, at first, wasn't he saying, millions of Americans will get sick? And now he's saying, thousands. Like, he's modified his prediction. And yet there is this talk still about flattening the curve and extending the lockdown and the social distancing.
So let's talk about flattening the curve really quickly. What we know now from Britain and from California is that this is more contagious than we'd expected, meaning that more people have been exposed to it, and it's less deadly than expected. Although the early numbers were telling us, initially they were saying 8 and 10% mortality rate of cases. Then they said 3 to 4% from China. Dr. Fauci has actually said, he's written this in the New England Journal of Medicine, that the true death rate is probably closer to 0.1%, which is nothing more than a flu. And so the question is, why is he saying that in private, in the medical field, while he is spreading fear in the public domain? I think that's a really important question that people need to ponder. Secondly, we need to understand that the people who are driving the narrative in the media and controlling the narrative in the media oftentimes have a horse in the race. So if you look at the first major models that came out, they were released from Imperial College in London. And this is the model that says 2.2 million Americans could die and 500,000 Britons. What we now know is that the guy who wrote that was used to spread all over the media. Imperial College of London takes money from the Gates Foundation. That man, Neil Ferguson, who wrote the model, walked it back several weeks later and said, well, actually, I don't think it's going to be that bad. He testified in front of Parliament. He said, actually, in Britain, we think that the death rate it's not going to be 500,000 people who die. It's probably going to be 20,000 people. And more than half of those would have died anyway this year.
But listen, Leslie,
so
let's be fair.
He was off by a factor of 50. And yet no one is pushing this, except that somebody did push it, which is Oxford University. And a team of epidemiologists from Oxford pushed back and said they thought this was grossly exaggerated. The assumptions were wrong and all these things. And this guy, Neil Ferguson, actually sits on certain committees at the World Health Organization, who also takes money from the Gates Foundation. Huge money.
So to play devil's advocate here, let's say that Neil Ferguson was simply mistaken. Let's just say that it's not because he has a horse in the race, but he actually just, made some erroneous assumptions. And then he pedaled because he realized I was wrong. Is that a possibility too?
If that were the case, then why didn't everybody stop the lockdown? Why did they move forward? Why did they actually get worse in Britain than better?
Oh, you mean they moved forward with the lockdown after he backpedaled?
Yes. And here's the other thing is I don't think I fully completed the idea of flattening the curve and whether or not that's a good thing. The best thing in the world you can do with something that's not particularly dangerous is to have everybody get it. Because if everybody who's not at risk gets it, then they actually do provide true herd immunity and protect those who are at risk. So you have the elderly, those with diabetes, those with heart problems and things like that, the people who are really at risk, self-isolate, take care of them, let everybody else get it, and then they're protected. Wouldn't that be the best thing to do? No drugs, no vaccines, no risks to them. But the thing is, that is not an approach that sells a lot of vaccines. And the thing is, you need a lot of fear generally to sell vaccines. I mean, that's what happens. Frighten people and they'll take it. They'll demand it. They'll beg for it. And following up on your point about Dr. Fauci, what he said about not wanting people to develop herd immunity, to me, that really lets the cat out of the bag. He doesn't want herd immunity to develop in the population. Now, why would that be the case? Because they want a vaccine. He is developing one of Gates's vaccines in his own group at the National Institutes of Health, which has taken $100 million from Gates.
So I'm surprised Gates is such a big player in all of this because, I mean, didn't he just have his, tech company and then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? How did he become involved in all of this?
So 20 years ago, Microsoft was the subject of major antitrust lawsuits in both the United States and Europe. They were dragged in court in front of the Federal Trade Commission and the European Trade Commission for their anti-competitive practices. And they were threatened with being broken up. And the reason for this is because Bill Gates is reputed to be a very mercenary businessman. He did things that were incredibly anti-competitive. And he was operating as a monopoly and trying to put any competition out of business. And so they were going to break up Microsoft. And what happened was they got a small fine. I think it was like $300 or $400 million. But he was forced to step down as CEO, and he stayed on as chairman of the board. And right after that, within a year or two, he started doing all of this philanthropic work, interestingly. And that was when the Gates Foundation really began, and they started putting billions and billions of dollars into it. And gosh, I don't know what's in it now. If it's 60, it's a minimum of 60 billion. I think it's more like $80 billion, $90 billion, something like that that's in there. I think that the timing of Gates stepping down from Microsoft board and from Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's board, is very interesting. It's also interesting that Sergey Brin and Larry Page, who founded Google, stepped down in January from Google. I just find this all very interesting. A lot of CEOs have been stepping down in the last few months.
And what do you make of that, Leslie?
Well, I don't know, Hilda. I'm not going to even speculate. I find it very peculiar with respect to Larry Page and all these others. With respect to Bill Gates, I think it's very clear that he wants to work on his little baby, which is vaccinating the population. That's his true objective.
And the truth is, most people just hear the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and they don't know what they're about. But there's actually a history, and it's not a pretty one, of what he's been doing with forced vaccinations in India, right? And in African countries. And maybe we'll put a link so people can pursue that more because time doesn't allow us to go into that very much. But what I have heard him saying right now about our situation in the United States is he said he thinks we have to, sooner or later, we'll either have to have some kind of certificate proving that we've either had the coronavirus and dealt with it, or we have to have a certificate proving that we've had a vaccination.
So let me break it down for you because I can do it very quickly.
Sure.
The Gates Foundation started the Gavi Alliance, which is a global alliance for vaccines. Okay? Gavi. They gave him $750 million to get going, and they've given him a couple $2 billion since then. The Gates Foundation funds vaccine makers all over the world. The Gates Foundation gave $100 million to the National Institutes of Health in the U.S., over $13 million to the CDC. They gave $229 million to the World Health Organization in 2018 alone. They gave $1.5 billion to the Gavi Alliance between 2016 and 2019. And the Gates Foundation and the Gavi Alliance are in the top 4 of all donors in the entire world to the World Health Organization. It goes top 4 or 5. It goes, the U.S. is number 1 at 280 million roughly. The Gates Foundation is number 2 at 229 million. This is just for 2018 alone. The UK is just behind the Gates Foundation. And then I believe Gavi is next at 158 or 153 million. And then Germany, or maybe Germany comes right before Gavi, but it's right around there. So you're talking about Bill Gates has given so much money to the World Health Organization that he gets rights that only voting member countries get.
Oh,
He
my
has
goodness.
tremendous influence. And the same guy that wrote the model at Imperial College in London sits on all these different boards at the World Health Organization, modeling things and creating these plans for pandemic preparedness. There's a very big, tangled web here.
Coming up, Zach Bush offers some simple tools, including gardening and connecting with nature, that will help make us more resilient at this time.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you in part by Grass-Fed Blood Vitality by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements makes New Zealand-sourced, nose-to-tail organ meats, bone marrow, and blood in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Weston A. Price traveled the world to study ancestral human nutrition, and he has written about many accounts of tribes whose diets consisted of milk, meat, and blood. These tribes included the Bahima tribe, Nilotic tribes, the Maasai, the Muhima, and the Nur tribe. Price wrote, "The Nurs at Malacca on the Nile River are a unique tribe because of their remarkable stature. Many of the women are 6 feet tall, and the men range from 6 feet to 7.5 feet in height. Their food consists very largely of animal life of the Nile, dairy products, milk, and blood from the herds. Throughout the centuries, these tribes have depended very largely on milk, meat, and blood. They milk the cows daily and bleed the steers at regular intervals by a unique process. These 3 sources, milk, blood, and meat, provide them with liberal supplies of bodybuilding minerals and the special vitamins, both fat-soluble and water-soluble. Blood Vitality provides us with all of the nutritional building blocks we need to support our own life force, blood. Our ancestors knew that blood made us healthy, smart, and strong, and thankfully this wisdom hasn't been entirely lost. Throughout many cultures, blood is still honored every day as a sacred food and used in many dishes. Sausage, pancakes, soup, pastries, even candy bars are all made with blood. Blood was and still is a highly prized delicacy. Visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world left out. And Toups & Co. Organics. They do things differently. Skincare products should nourish the skin without hormone-disrupting toxins and fragrances. Toups & Co. Organics was started by a husband and wife team that realized that what is put on the body is just as important as what is put in it. All of Toups & Co. Organic skincare products are made with wholesome, clean, and recognizable ingredients. Organic and fair trade ingredients, highest quality cold-pressed olive oil, tallow from grass-fed cows, certified organic-grade essential oils, and, of course, love. Basically, they only use what they would want for their own family, and their products work. Their kids' hair and skin glows and shines, and yours can too. Check out their products, skincare, makeup, deodorant, soaps, baby wash, balms, and more at toupsandco.com. That's Toups, like soups, but with a T, and co.com. Use the coupon code WISETRADITIONS, all lowercase, one word, for 10% off your first order. Toups & Co. Organics. They do things differently. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Batting cleanup today is Dr. Zach Bush. Zach is a well-known physician, international educator, and thought leader on the microbiome. He has a kind of wild prescription for us today for how to restore our health and the health of our planet. It has to do with reconnecting with nature and one another. To hear all of what Zach had to say, check out Wise Traditions Podcast 248 wherever you get your podcasts.
Everything we've talked about so far, from the pollution to the coronavirus to, a bacterial communication network and microbiome, that's all in the biology field. Biology is the visible portion of life, but it's, of course, not the fabric of life. The fabric of life is actually atoms and the atomic structure. Atoms are extremely minuscule, little energetic events that are happening all the time, and they organize themselves into different structures that we call the periodic chart. These periodic elements are arrangements of protons and electrons. And in that, they function as little gravity centers, if you will, that create density through organization of space. And so the atomic structure of humans is the same as that as a rock, it's the same as the table in front of you, the same as your computer in front of you. These are all reorganizations of atomic energy. And at that level, at the atomic energy level, we are also invited to interact and be in a co-creative process. And a hug is an extraordinary avenue into an energetic atomic experience. Every split of a millionth of a second, you're exchanging electrons with your environment. And when you go to give a hug, you're swapping electrons. You're literally exchanging data of your experience of your day, the love you may feel for that individual, the tiredness that might be in your bones today from just your incredible output, or your stress fatigue from financial stress and child stress and everything else going on in your life. You're exchanging that data when you get a hug or you give a hug. And so it's a powerful way to update one another's software, if you will, with the information that we've received today. And so that hug is your optimal update procedure in the day. If you're going to reboot your computer and update the software, make sure you get in a hug or 7 of them in a day to improve your function. And this has an immediate effect on our immune system. As we talked about earlier, this fragility of human immunity and mortality from otherwise benign signals like viruses are happening because we don't have enough resilience. And that resilience, or the lack of resilience, is from a lack of communication. You need that hug. A nice study showed that if you get more than 7 hugs a day, you have 30% less likelihood of ever having flu. And so there's this beautiful interaction between the human immune system, the microbiome, and the energetics of hugs that start to create this matrix of communication. The hug, you're communicating at the electron level. The exchange of genetic information in that hug also happens, where you can swap microbiome on the skin, you can swap it in your breath, and that's extremely important. The more robust you get in the exchange of information at the microbial level, the stronger your immune system function is, the more clear the immune system understands how to operate within the matrix of, millions of foreign species that are interacting with your body all the time appropriately. That balance is really achieved through biodiversity, not through isolation. And so the hug is a critical tool for healing. It's a critical tool for communication, critical tool for updating our own consciousness and exchange of respect for one another.
Wow, you're right. And even if we don't know or understand all the physiology that you just described, I mean, we know that it feels good. There's something powerful that happens when we connect with each other. And I'm thinking of a person right now who lives all by herself. And, she feels like she's dying emotionally, because maybe physically she's not getting that information exchange. She's not getting all of those electron interactions that she needs.
Oh, that's definitely happening all over the world right now, and tragically in ICUs. I think this is the biggest humanitarian crisis I've ever seen in healthcare. I've never seen a situation where patients are dying alone in ICUs. That has never happened in my experience. I think in our lifetimes, we've never seen this level of fear induced over something that's harmless to the most people that will see it. It's a virus that is out there and is harmless to 50%, to the point they don't even have symptoms. Another 40% will have mild to moderate symptoms. And so, 90% completely benign, dangerous to 0.1% of the population. And yet we're treating this thing like it's, some horrible, variation of Ebola or something. And we've adopted that belief because of the misled medical treatments that are increasing mortality in our hospitals. New York hospitals are the worst place in the world to have COVID because there's an 88% mortality rate. Nowhere else in the world have we seen that level of mortality. And it's because we're using the most extreme measures for isolation that's ever been witnessed. And so the more isolated a system gets, the more dysfunction it's going to have. And so what that woman is experiencing is a version of that. And again, actually, if we look at the physics, it's coded right in the matrix of the scientific laws. The second law of thermodynamics, which is one of the most tried and true truths that we have in scientific experimentation, is a profoundly simple statement. The second law of thermodynamics said any system put in isolation will increase its entropy. Entropy is a physics term for chaos. Any system put in isolation will increase its chaos. That is a phenomenally fascinating and bizarre truth that nobody's really figured out why that is. If you take an atom and put it in isolation, if you take a molecule and put it in isolation, if you take a human cell and put it in isolation, it increases its chaos level. In fact, cancer is in fact a cell left in isolation. You can't get cancer until that cell is completely isolated from all of its neighbors and then goes into a proliferative state, thinking it's the last living life form to carry on its genomic code. And so a cancer cell is a desperately lonely cell trying to do damage control and trying to replicate itself before it dies. And so that's just true on the deepest level. And this woman is now experiencing that in isolation. She is increasing chaos. And we've seen this as a form of punishment for thousands of years. The most severe punishment we can give is solitary confinement. And we're doing it to our elderly right now, our most vulnerable populations. We're doing it to our children right now, who are now isolated away from their friends at the most important time socially for many of these kids that are graduating from high school and college in isolation, taken out of some of their most formative social experiences for some completely theoretical fear at this point of death. No college kids have died from this in any sort of healthy state. You have to be profoundly disadvantaged at the biologic level before this has any threat to you under the age of 50.
Well, and so that brings me to the point. One of the fears I see among all of my healthy friends is they're afraid that they're going to give it to someone because they consider themselves asymptomatic carriers, or they've heard that term. Is that a misunderstanding as well?
Yeah, that's the fear paradigm right there. Again, humans are not the mode of transfer of viruses in all of history. Humans are very late to the show. We've only been here 200,000 years by the fossil record. Planet Earth has been here 4.5 billion years. The first viruses that we can track back through the fossil record and the rest are somewhere around 3.5 billion years ago. And so there was 3.5 billion years that passed before humans showed up, with viruses creating life and life abundantly all over the world and creating adaptation, biodiversification, all of this. And so we are not the primary vector for viruses, never have been. We support one another through communication of the virome. And so we don't make each other sick. We can actually are passing information along. And if that information is then poisoned with a toxin in the air pollution or otherwise, then it could cause some harm. But you aren't the vector. It's the nature around us. And so again, how should we interact with the elderly and vulnerable? We should take them to a national park and spend the day out in the fresh air with them if at all possible. If not, if you need to go visit them in a nursing home or some other environment, make sure it happens outdoors. And then your risk of having some abnormally dense amount of viral production affecting their lungs drops to infinitesimally low experience. You want them to have the microbiome in its biodiversity around them, and then whatever virus may or may not be present around you or your loved ones or whatever becomes a very tiny part of the puzzle. If you walk into an isolated room and you spend a few hours there and there's no fresh air put into that space, now a virus can become abnormally consolidated and actually present some sort of risk, especially if the person is on medications like statin drugs and ACE inhibitors and the like. So the cardiovascular patients and all of them, are they vulnerable? Yes, because of their pharmaceutical predisposition and because of their isolation away from nature. And so if you're going to go and engage with elderly, get them outside, get them out in a wheelchair, push them out into the yard, enjoy space and time with them. It takes a considerable amount of time together, meaning like hours to days before there's any real risk. In South Korea, Italy, there's been many reports that have come out around the world that even healthcare workers that are in and around these patients that are dying from COVID, 12, 14-hour shifts are not getting sick. There wasn't a single hospital-acquired case of COVID noted in these hospitals. That's unusual. Most viruses, you'll see hospital-acquired thing. What it's suggesting is COVID is harder to get in short-term, contact with one another than ever before. And again, people say, oh, well, that's because they're taking all of these measures in hospitals. No, the measures in the hospitals are actually making things worse. In places like cruise ships, we see extremely low fatality rate because they're on a ship out in the ocean, they're away from pollution, and they're safe. And so we see average age on the cruise ships that came into Oakland, for example. That ship had 3,700 people on it. 1/3 of the ship was tested to show that there was at least 10% of the total ship that had become infected with COVID. And yet only 3 people ended up dying, and they didn't end up having any acute illness leading to hospitalization or death until after they had left the ship after 14 days of quarantine. So they actually had gone through the whole course of COVID, had come out the other side of COVID, and were having some respiratory symptoms when they left the ship. They were then put into army tents and all of this toxic air of Oakland. And then they got progressively sicker over the next few days and weeks. And, weeks after they already had COVID and passed through their system, they're dying from respiratory failure, from secondary pneumonias and all that were acquired in the hospital care and all that. So we really have to critically look at, what is causing the virus to spread. And is it a bad thing? The virus doesn't seem to be a bad thing. The bad thing is the toxicity on the other side. And so that's pharmaceuticalized patients. There's very clear drug predisposition here. ACE inhibitors, which are a common blood pressure medication, and statin drugs both upregulate abnormally the receptor for the virus. The virus carries in the air pollution content like cyanide, and you get a hypoxic injury. Not because of the virus, but because the human biology has been screwed up by the pharmacy. The virus then carries in human toxicity on the back end of it, and suddenly you have a life-threatening event. Again, the virus is playing a very small role in that, and I would say a very benign role in that. It's just doing what it's supposed to, which is enter through the ACE2 receptor in the lungs. That's how it's supposed to do. That's how we're supposed to get this genomic update. And yet we've abnormally created an abnormal landing place for those by pharmaceuticalizing the lung. And we've created a toxic potential for complications in the hospital systems.
Our guests today were Sally Fallon Morell, Leslie Manookian, and Dr. Zach Bush. You can find Sally at nourishingtraditions.com. Leslie Manookian is at lesliemanookian.com. And Zach is at zachbushmd.com. And I'm Hilda Labrada-Gore. You can find me at holistichilda.com. For the transcript for this episode, go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And now for a review from Apple Podcasts. Bell Alexa 23 says it's the best podcast around. Hands down, the Weston A. Price Foundation podcast is the best place for all your information. If you listen here, you won't need much else. Stick to their principles because they are tested and true. I am so grateful to the Weston A. Price Foundation for putting out thoughtful, informed, and against-the-grain information. They are much needed in this highly censored world in which we live. Keep up the good work. Bell Alexa 23, you can count on that. And thank you so much for your review. As you may know, we are close to 1,000 podcast reviews, and we would love to have your encouragement and your review as well to let other folks know that this show is worth listening to. Just go to Apple Podcast and click on the rate and review button. And thank you so much for listening. Stay well, my friend, y que tengas un feliz año nuevo.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.